The cabin of Flight 347 buzzed with the usual hum of passengers settling in, the soft overhead chime signaling the final boarding call. The air held a mix of excitement and exhaustion, some travelers eager to reach their destination, others just hoping for a smooth ride. Among them, 78-year-old Margaret Hayes sat quietly in her aisle seat, her frail hands gripping the armrests as she adjusted her seatbelt. She had never been fond of flying, but today she had no choice. She was on her way to see her grandson, whom she had not seen in years. It was supposed to be a simple journey, but she had no idea that this flight would become a moment she would never forget. Across the aisle, flight attendant Lisa Carter moved briskly down the narrow passage, her polished uniform crisp, her expression neutral. She had worked in the airline industry for years and had seen it all: fussy passengers, entitled travelers, and endless requests. To her, this was just another flight, another shift to get through. But today would be different. Margaret, feeling the dry air in the cabin, licked her lips and pressed the call button. She waited patiently as Lisa finished speaking with another passenger before approaching. "Yes, ma'am?" Lisa asked, her tone polite but distant. Margaret offered a warm, apologetic smile. "Excuse me, dear. Could I trouble you for a small cup of water?" Her voice was gentle, almost hesitant, as if she did not want to be a bother. Lisa glanced down at her watch. Beverage service had not started yet, and she had a strict routine to follow. "I am sorry, ma'am. We will be serving drinks after takeoff," she replied, her tone clipped. Margaret nodded understandingly, though a slight disappointment crossed her face. She did not want to be difficult, but her throat felt parched, and she could already feel a light dizziness setting in. A few minutes passed, and she pressed the call button again. Lisa returned, this time with a hint of impatience in her posture. "Ma'am, as I said, drinks will be served after takeoff." Margaret swallowed, her voice a little weaker this time. "I understand, dear. It is just that I am feeling a bit lightheaded. I would really appreciate just a small sip of water." Lisa sighed, her professionalism slipping. "Rules are rules," she said firmly, before turning on her heel and walking away. A few passengers nearby exchanged glances, sensing the tension. Some frowned, while others whispered among themselves. The cabin was not full, and there were no urgent matters requiring Lisa's attention. A small cup of water would have taken seconds, so why the refusal? Margaret took a slow breath, trying to steady herself. She was not one to cause a scene, but her discomfort was growing. The recycled cabin air made her throat feel scratchy, and she knew from experience that dehydration could quickly make her feel unwell. 4 minutes passed. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin as passengers settled in. Then, something unexpected happened. A man seated a few rows ahead who had quietly observed the exchange stood up. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried an air of quiet authority. Without a word, he walked to the front of the plane and disappeared into the cockpit. Moments later, Lisa's name was called over the intercom. Her confident stride faltered as she turned, her face suddenly pale. Passengers watched as she hesitated before making her way toward the front. Whispered conversations spread like wildfire as everyone tried to piece together what was happening. Then, the murmurs turned to hushed gasps as Lisa reappeared, this time without her polished composure. Her expression was one of shock, her hands slightly trembling. She did not return to her duties. Instead, she grabbed her bag from the storage compartment, her face burning with embarrassment. Passengers watched in stunned silence as she was escorted toward the exit. Margaret, still in her seat, blinked in confusion, unaware of what had just unfolded, what had happened in the cockpit. And why was Lisa leaving before the flight even took off? The entire cabin waited in suspense, but one thing was clear. Justice had been served, and it had happened faster than anyone could have expected. Margaret sat still in her seat, her hands lightly trembling as she tried to process what had just happened. The cabin, moments ago filled with quiet conversations and the occasional laugh, had fallen into an eerie silence. Passengers exchanged glances, some leaning toward their neighbors, whispering in hushed tones. The air felt thick with curiosity, confusion, and a growing sense that something significant had just unfolded. She glanced toward the front of the plane where Lisa had disappeared. The flight attendant, who only moments ago had seemed so confident, so in control, had walked away with none of that poise left. Margaret did not know what had been said to her, but it was clear that whatever happened in that cockpit had changed everything. Margaret shifted in her seat, feeling a strange mixture of emotions. She had not wanted this. All she had asked for was a small sip of water, nothing more. She was used to being overlooked, used to the world moving too fast to notice people like her. But someone had noticed. Someone had seen what happened and decided it was unacceptable. She glanced around the cabin, trying to figure out who it was. The tall man who had gone into the cockpit was now back in his seat, his face calm, almost unreadable. He had not said a word to her, not even a glance in her direction, but she had a feeling he had been the one responsible. Something about him stood out, not just his sharp professional appearance, but the quiet authority he carried. He was not just another passenger. A soft voice from the seat next to her pulled her from her thoughts. "Are you all right, ma'am?" Margaret turned to see a young woman probably in her early 30s looking at her with concern. She had kind eyes and held a water bottle in her hand, offering it with a gentle smile. Margaret hesitated for a moment before accepting it. "Thank you, dear," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She took a small sip, feeling the cool water ease the dryness in her throat. The woman nodded, her eyes flickering toward the front of the plane. "That was unexpected," she murmured. Margaret sighed softly. "I never meant for anyone to get in trouble." The woman gave her a knowing look. "You did nothing wrong." Margaret wanted to believe that, but something inside her still felt uneasy. She had never liked conflict. She had spent her entire life avoiding it, choosing kindness over confrontation, patience over anger. And yet, here she was, at the center of something she did not fully understand. A few rows ahead, a man in a business suit leaned toward his seatmate. "She was completely out of line," he muttered. "It takes 2 seconds to get a cup of water. What kind of person refuses an elderly woman something so simple?" His seatmate, a middle-aged woman, nodded in agreement. "I have never seen anything like that before. I mean, I get that they have rules, but come on." Margaret could hear their words, but she kept her eyes forward, pretending not to listen. She did not want to be the topic of discussion. She just wanted to get to her destination, to see her grandson, to have a quiet and uneventful trip. But it was too late for that now. The intercom crackled to life, and the captain's voice came through, steady and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the brief delay. We will be departing shortly. Thank you for your patience." Margaret noticed the way the flight attendants at the front were whispering among themselves, their faces serious. One of them, a younger woman with dark hair pulled into a tight bun, kept glancing toward the cockpit, her lips pressed into a thin line. Whatever had happened back there had sent ripples through the entire crew. Lisa had been removed from the flight, that much was clear. But the question lingering in everyone's mind was, why? Margaret took another sip of water, her hands wrapped tightly around the bottle as if grounding herself. She replayed the brief interaction in her mind. Lisa had been dismissive, yes, but was it really enough to get her fired? Flight attendants had to follow rules, and maybe she had just been trying to do her job. But then again, Margaret had flown many times before, and she had never been denied water before takeoff. It was not an unreasonable request. The young woman, next to her, sighed, shaking her head. "I have a feeling there is more to this than we know," she said quietly. Margaret nodded. She had the same feeling. The engines roared to life, and soon the plane was taxiing down the runway. The tension in the cabin had not faded, but now it mixed with the usual anticipation of takeoff. People adjusted their seatbelts, some looking out the windows, others checking their phones one last time before switching them to airplane mode. As the plane ascended into the sky, Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her thoughts. Whatever had happened was out of her hands now. All she could do was wait and see how the rest of the flight unfolded. But even as she tried to let it go, the questions remained. Who was the man who had intervened? What exactly had been said in that cockpit? And most importantly, what did Lisa do that had made the airline act so quickly? Margaret did not know it yet, but this flight was far from ordinary, and the answers to those questions would soon come to light in a way no one could have expected. As the plane settled into its cruising altitude, the tension in the cabin did not fade. If anything, it grew heavier, thick with unspoken questions. Margaret sat quietly in her seat, her hands resting on her lap, but her mind raced with thoughts she could not shake. Lisa was gone, just like that. No explanation, no second chances, just escorted off the plane like she had done something far worse than denying an elderly woman a simple cup of water. Margaret had not wanted anyone to lose their job. It had not been her intention at all, but clearly something else had been at play, something beyond what she had seen. The young woman beside her, who had introduced herself as Rachel, leaned in slightly. "I have been on dozens of flights, and I have never seen a flight attendant get removed like that," she whispered. Margaret nodded, still staring straight ahead. "It all happened so fast," she murmured. Rachel sighed, glancing toward the front of the plane where another flight attendant, a man in his mid-40s, moved about the cabin with careful precision. It was clear he was trying to maintain a sense of normalcy, but there was an uneasiness in his movements. He knew something. Meanwhile, the passengers had not stopped whispering. Some were upset, others intrigued, but nearly everyone had an opinion. That was extreme, a man in the row behind Margaret muttered. Firing her on the spot over water? His seatmate, an older woman with silver hair, shook her head. "I do not think it was just about the water." Margaret turned slightly, listening but keeping her gaze forward. She agreed. There had to be more. But what? Across the aisle, the man who had walked into the cockpit earlier remained quiet. He was reading something on his phone, his expression unreadable. He had been the one to take action, but he had not spoken a word about it since. He had simply returned to his seat, unbothered by the stir he had caused. Rachel must have noticed Margaret glancing in his direction. "I wonder who he is," she whispered. Margaret hesitated, then spoke softly. "Whoever he is, he has more authority than a regular passenger." Rachel nodded in agreement. There was something about the way he carried himself. Calm, assured, like he had handled far bigger problems than an unprofessional flight attendant. Then, almost as if he had heard them, the man shifted in his seat and stood. Without a word, he walked toward the back of the plane, disappearing into the galley. Rachel's eyes followed him. "I need to know what is going on," she murmured. Margaret gave her a small, amused smile. "Curiosity can be dangerous, dear." Rachel chuckled. "Maybe, but I think everyone on this plane is thinking the same thing." Meanwhile, at the front of the cabin, the remaining flight attendants moved with quiet urgency. One of them, a younger woman with short blonde hair, kept throwing glances toward the passengers as if she knew they were watching. Her nervous energy was impossible to miss. Margaret could feel it. Something bigger was at play. Minutes passed, and then the man returned. He slid back into his seat, calm as ever. But something about him was different now. He seemed more alert, more focused. Then, unexpectedly, he turned his head slightly and looked directly at Margaret. She stiffened. His gaze was not unkind, but it was searching, assessing, and then, just as quickly, he looked away. Rachel let out a slow breath. "That was intense," Margaret exhaled, trying to steady her nerves. Yes, it was. The man knew something, that much was clear. But whether or not he would reveal it was another matter entirely. As the flight continued, passengers settled into quiet conversations, but the atmosphere never returned to normal. Margaret could feel it in her bones. This was not over yet. Not by a long shot. Margaret could feel the weight of unspoken tension pressing down on the cabin. The hum of the engines was steady, but the atmosphere inside the plane was anything but calm. Conversations had quieted to murmurs, with passengers sneaking glances toward the flight attendants, the cockpit, and the mysterious man who had intervened earlier. It was as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. Rachel shifted in her seat, restless. "Something is off," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft hum of the aircraft. Margaret nodded, gripping her hands together. "I can feel it too." The flight attendants continued their usual duties, but their movements were more mechanical, more forced. The blonde woman who had looked nervous earlier now seemed outright anxious. She moved quickly between passengers, her eyes darting toward the front of the plane as if she was waiting for some kind of signal. Margaret noticed the older male flight attendant pause at the service station, glancing toward the cockpit. He exchanged a brief look with the co-pilot, who had stepped out momentarily. Something silent passed between them. And then the co-pilot disappeared back behind the locked door. Rachel caught the exchange as well. "What was that about?" Margaret exhaled. "I do not know, but I do not like it." Just then, the man who had stepped in earlier, the one with an air of authority, slowly stood from his seat again. This time, he did not head toward the cockpit or the galley. Instead, he turned toward the flight attendants at the front of the plane, his posture firm but not aggressive. The blonde flight attendant stiffened as he approached. Their conversation was too quiet to hear, but Margaret could see the tension in the woman's face as he spoke to her. She nodded quickly, swallowing hard, before turning away and disappearing into the galley. Rachel whispered, "She looks scared." Margaret frowned. "Yes, she does." The man did not return to his seat. Instead, he lingered near the front of the cabin, scanning the passengers. He was watching, waiting. Then suddenly the plane jolted slightly. Not turbulence, but a shift in the air that felt unnatural. A few passengers straightened in their seats, alarmed but unsure if it was worth
panicking over. Rachel gripped her armrest.
"What was that?" Margaret's heart pounded. "I do not know." The intercom crackled, and the captain's voice came through, slightly strained but controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We are experiencing a minor issue that we are currently addressing. Thank you for your cooperation." Margaret exchanged a look with Rachel. That was not the kind of announcement pilots made for regular turbulence. The blonde flight attendant returned, her face even paler than before. She moved quickly, leaning toward the older male attendant and whispering something urgently. His expression darkened. Margaret felt a sinking sensation in her stomach. The man at the front of the cabin took a step closer to them, his voice low but firm. "Tell me exactly what is happening." The blonde hesitated, then whispered something that made the older flight attendant's eyes widen. Margaret saw the shift in the man's posture. He was no longer just an observer. He was now in control. Rachel's grip tightened on her armrest. "Margaret, something is really wrong." Margaret did not respond. She could already feel it. Then, without warning, the overhead lights flickered. Once. The engines rumbled slightly louder and the air in the cabin grew thick with unease. Margaret held her breath. Whatever was happening, it was far from over.